Oh, my friends, is the Fat Man re- returning with my revisitation of Game Designer Workshop's Twilight 2000. This particular source book, and we'll call it a source book because that's really what it is, called Howling Wilderness. It includes a special bonus of the Twilight City Maker, so that helps you. You have a set of base rules in here for randomly generating towns and cities. What this is, this update and uh, compendium, if you will, of what's going on in the United States, in the U.S. Continental United States after 2000. So it's already taken into assumption, and the way this reads, this actually, to me, and I didn't think about it until after I read through the whole thing and had a chance for it to percolate in my brain, that this would be potentially the last source book that you might get in the series. It's make the assumption that you've gone through most of the 6 or 7 United States-based adventure modules, which I have yet to preview, and we're coming up on those next. Uh, and after they have been played out, then and your characters have either muddled the waters or effectively altered the would-be history that was pending, then this is what would be your final cap to continue playing the game in a continually deteriorating United States. It goes into section by section, region by region, and does a fairly good job. And it also gives us a lot of detailed information for history, for backstory, based off of what was going on in the States during the beginning of the war and during the war, and what's happening while your players are over in Europe and doing their Poland campaigns and other attached game modules. The biggest impact, of course, is the style of combat that took place. The nuclear exchanges were what's considered a limited strategic series of exchanges. These took place instead of one massive all-out, suicidal blow where both sides just launched everything they had with the intentions of eradicating everybody. Both sides took their time, if you will. They initially had done limited exchanges targeting very high profile, high interest government and military installations and targets, and then switched over to more limited tactical strikes where they went after specific targets in specific areas. They tried to avoid mass destruction. They didn't try to level all the cities, although the resulting firestorms and or panic and terror of the civilian populations pretty much did that for them. This took place over a period of several years. The war started in '96 or '97, and by the year 2000, most of the nukes are pretty much spent, and or what few are left are either being husbanded very carefully by those few that are in charge, because that's what keeps them in charge, or have some lack of delivery issue. So it's much harder to launch the ICBMs from control, or if your control and command system is completely devastated and you don't have the technicians still there to fire them. And having portable, movable systems are fine, except if you've ever tried to maintain a high-end long-range strategic bomber, it still requires a lot of infrastructure that just doesn't exist by the end of 2000. So uh, it's petered out. But the cause, while it didn't wipe out civilization and or didn't wipe out humanity as we know it, what it did do and has done is begin this uh, slow destruction of civilization and the foundations of what makes a civilization, our modern civilization, work. And it's now unraveling faster and faster because every negative thing compounds the previous problems, and this just exacerbates the situation, and now it's snowballing, becoming worse by the year. And one of those things that was impacted by all this nuclear exchange was the weather patterns, and they emphasize that quite a bit in here. That the weather, imagine that the weather plays an important set of role in the backstory of any storyline-based game system, as well as any mechanic-based game system, if you allow it to. In this case, on a strategic level, on the overall level, it's changed the weather patterns around the world. So areas of the world that were well known for having high water or rainfall have seen less of it, or they've seen more of it. And in other places, we see a resurgence from areas that were previously considered drought-stricken and dry. The opposite effects happening. The rain's coming in now, and they're becoming more vibrant and verdant than they used to be. And you can go back in the evolution of the Earth's history and see far enough back, you can see that there's areas like the Great Sahara Desert, which once was a paradise. Well, that paradise is returning, where places that like the central Midwest is turning into a dust bowl again. So the drought has and is playing a huge problem with the states. And then we got the attack and the aftermath. This basically explained what I was talking about with how the limited exchanges and the weather's affected things. Another thing that caused a problem for the United States was that it has, like most governments, have made every effort to plan for the continuation of the government so it's intact. I mean, you don't lead your country well if you have no the head of state. You don't have anybody in charge. You don't have any infrastructure to support those people in charge. So, in the States, we had something called the National Plan for Emergency Preparedness, which was established in 1964. And the government laid down plans for survival of the nation after thermonuclear exchange, so on and so on and so on. So FEMA was envisioned at the time as predecessor. Strategic stockpiles began and supplies were set aside. This includes fuel, food, medicines, and so on and so forth. The government also constructed numerous bunkers for various purposes, for various command and control, for the government itself, for strategic strategic supplies, as well as the sort of materials and stuff you would want to have in order to rebuild a shattered infrastructure. The mass protection of the population was a placebo. It's not possible to protect a large-scale population. It just isn't. Now, from this sort of thing. And all the other stuff that goes hand in hand with this kind of war is going to take its toll. Everything from the bombs themselves and disease, and then starvation and exposure, and then there's humanity itself. Humanity is a bunch of sheep, and they panic at the first sign of a problem, and the majority of the population will do that in any given population. I don't care how structured it is. And then, of course, the government broke up its. It says here, according to the plan, the government agencies were divided into three categories: A, B, and C. Category A agencies, the capital level departments, and independent agencies such as the CIA, are those which require continual operation through an attack and the immediate post-attack phase. Category B agencies such as the National Science Foundation, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, are those which are to be reconstituted as soon as post-attack conditions permit. A and B agencies rate emergency relocation teams, shelters, backup stockpiles, record centers, and so on. Category C agencies are those which do not rate shelters. They are ordered to disperse and reconstitute themselves when the conditions permit, making their personnel available for other emergency duties in the meantime. Basically, if you're in a Category C, you're up a creek without a paddle, and good luck. And having the idea that they're all going to come back together after the bomb goes off is just, everybody knew that was, like I said, a placebo. Not going to happen. So, when we talk about the Thanksgiving massacre, when the government, as soon as the bombs started to go and the war was breaking out became extremely serious at this point, the government did what it was supposed to do. It followed its procedures. It bunkered down in some cases, and unfortunately, there were some problems with the president, and the main part of the U.S. government, civilian government, ends up getting caught with their pants down, so to speak. Let's see. November, data sources indicated an all-attack might be imminent. Congress declared an early recess, ostensibly for the Thanksgiving holiday, but this fooled no one. Teams were sent out once again, even though some provisions were made. Families, team members, less than half of the required personnel showed up for duty. Everyone from the president on down seemed to think the whole thing was another false alarm. Day after Thanksgiving, an orbiting military surveillance satellite picked up a number of Irish signatures, characteristic of SLBMs, or submarine-launched ballistic missiles. In minutes, messages were zipping through the established channels. Alarms began ringing across the nation. President Tanner was killed not by a strike on the Washington, but by an accident during takeoff of the kneecap aircraft. The mystery of precisely what went wrong with one of the most rigorously inspected, carefully maintained aircraft in the nation has never been solved. The FFA never properly investigated the accident. Because of an inbound missile had been detected, Vice President Pemberton elected to try and make it to the special facility at Mount Weather. Upon being informed that the president's death told no retaliatory action had been taken, Vice President was forced to delay her departure and retain a secure communications facility. The radios on the evacuation helicopter have never been considered reliable for this purpose. From the bomb shelter under the east wing of the White House, built during President Truman's tenure, never intended to withstand a direct hit, the Vice President then, after identifying herself, issued the proclamation of the existence of a state of war. Only Congress has the power to declare war, and the body was not in session and ordered retaliatory strikes on the USSR. She was killed a few minutes later when the missile detonated. For a time, the United States had no official national command authority. Speaker of the House Munson, the next in line, was skiing in Northern California. He slipped out of his vacation home and didn't leave a word of his destination. Munson was fanatical about his personal privacy. More than 22 hours passed where he could be located by CLS operatives and transferred to the nearest presidential emergency facility. Being sworn in, Munson's first official act was to proclaim the full provisions of the Federal Emergency Plan D were in effect. And these include, among other things, a declaration of martial law. The military government's claim to sovereignty is based on the FEPD documents and the government's proclamation of a state of war. So what we see here is this breakdown in the U.S. government. The civilian side of things gets hammered pretty hard. The military infrastructure is intact, and because of the declaration of martial law and the declaration of the intent of war, the military puts themselves into a command structure authority mindset, and as the civilian authority disintegrates, the military steps in and fills this role up a bit more. So later, when the civilian government starts to reconstitute itself, there's this conflict of interest between the two. And this is where we get during most of the game system, where you have the CivGov and the MilGov. And there's a conflict about who's actually in charge of the U.S. government at the time. And then we got the aftermath. December 1997, 98, January. Say it like that. In December 97, throughout the month of December, sporadic nuclear exchanges continued. The populous American panicked on President Munson ordered the Army National Guard units seized bulk food storage facilities across the country and took custody of what petroleum remained. Rationing of food and fuel was introduced. Fires and destruction caused by the bombs were gradually brought under control, and the government control of most urban areas was slowly regained, although some cities like Boston were never fully brought back under control after the strikes. Because of the damaged transportation network and the lack of fuel, there were minor distribution inequalities, some civil discontent, but little out-and-out rioting. The harvest in 97 was larger than average, was not evenly distributed through the country. Most of it is still in silos and elevators in the Midwest. We just lack the transportation capability to move them to the population centers. So on December 15, Munson, on the advice of what was left of Tanner's cabinet, issued the Emergency Relocation Decree. The purpose of this act was to relocate the nation's urban populations closer to the food-producing areas, minimize food transportation. There was considerable opposition from both rural and urban populations. People in an undamaged city were reluctant to suddenly pack up and leave. Conditions were still not bad over most of the country, and nobody wanted to desert the security of their homes and possessions. relocatees were only allowed to carry 50 kilograms of baggage to go to some unspecific place in the country. Rural communities were unwilling to have large numbers of outsiders forced upon them. Think about that for a minute. So, in addition to yet another problem or mistake, the government of the time decides, because we can't feed you in New York and Chicago and these in LA and these big huge cities on the coast, is we're going to move all of you to the Midwest, to the middle of nowhere, and you're going to give up your homes and your possessions, and you're going to set out on foot, in many cases under duress, because there's people with guns nearby and uniforms telling you don't have an option here. It's this or starve to death, and the majority of you are going to be forced out. Quite a few people stayed behind, ignored the commands and stayed behind, but a big chunk of the population found themselves being relocated. Upwards of several tens of millions of people. And many of them never make it to their destinations because of the distance and the conditions are deteriorating and the lack of food and what have you. This becomes another type of death march. And this is not set well. It doesn't make the government look well to a lot of the citizens. And then those communities in the Midwest suddenly find themselves, my hometown, 2,000 people would suddenly find itself with an additional 1,000 or 2,000 people who don't have housing for them. We have no jobs for them. There's no space for them, so to speak. And our own limited resources are stretched just looking after our own basic needs in those communities nearby. Not setting up things for a very good situation. So this is a bad move on the government's part and just adds to the problem. So January 98, extreme low temperatures, lack of heating fuel caused many civilian casualties, particularly in the continental interior. Slightly higher temperatures combined with several winter storms occurred in coastal areas. The aged, the infirm, and those weakened by lack of food exposure ranged from the first to die, but many others, otherwise healthy individuals, sickened and died as well. One advantage of the cold weather, though, is it was not noticed at the time, was the infectious diseases were kept in check. Relocation was halted to preserve fuel for heating and food transportation. As fuel resources dwindled, the rationing became more severe in the cities. This created problems. Citizens in every city felt they were being shortchanged and began the riots. A lot of places, the cities that were spared by the nuclear exchanges, were devastated by the civilian population as they went crazy. And here's a short map showing the key strategic locations where the Russian bombs had hit. So you can see that they really didn't target mass areas of the United States. There's not this mass EMP destruction that's proposed. My home state of Iowa, right here in this little map. And the only real serious target that's ever been a problem for us would be the SAC base in Omaha, right here. There's some stuff down in Kansas City, stuff in Illinois, but for the most intent purposes, this is Wisconsin. This is up here where Rob Gusterson's from, right? Yeah. So you can see in the same situation, there's not a lot of stuff here in these certain areas of the country that warrant large-scale attacks. Now, there was a report I read back in the 90s about a third-tier strategic. The Russian plan was to target the hardcore stuff and then move into the second range of stuff and then a third range of stuff, because that was somewhere the plan we had. So secondary large cities by the third wave, well, we've got some extra bombs to throw around. Let's go ahead and target the next, state capitals and large population centers, things like that. Now, so that just says that there's big chunks of the country, because the country is huge. It's just like Russia's huge. There's a lot of places here that's not going to see an EMP blast. It's not going to see radiation fallout. It's not going to see the bombs themselves. So what's going to happen is it's going to see the lack of communication, the lack of transportation, supply chains are going to break down. Our modern world is heavily dependent on the fact that we can get stuff from anywhere, everywhere. Example being that, earlier did where I did for this, I could order this online and it gets delivered and we don't think nothing of it. My breakfast probably came from another part of the country. Even though we produce a lot of food here, it seems like a lot of the stuff we eat comes from other places, not here. Go figure. All right, so breaking it down, blah, blah. 1 year on the new year, 2 new governments, makes the explanations. Oh, can't miss that. The Soviet-Mexican invasions. It says breakdown on 19 May, President Monson suffered a nervous breakdown, had to be relieved of successor, former Secretary of State, who succumbed to heart failure. His successor, former Secretary of Energy, was so overwhelmed by the enormity of the job she committed suicide. There was no longer an operating CLS that located a successor. The military assumed de facto control of all federal functions. At this point, the civilian government ceased to exist on the federal level in the United States. This is the power. This is why the military was in charge during many of those early uh, modules. The Mexican and Soviet invasions. On 2nd June, Mexican government ordered to protect its citizens, sent an army, including the Soviet division Cuba, across the Rio Grande. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were now governing the country, sent the army units in response. Okay, so one of those things that may or may not be known is the United States has a certain set of operating policies and procedures. The U.S. military is not supposed to operate within the U.S. borders in a official capacity. This is what our National Guard units are for, and this is what our civilian response agencies and stuff are for. It's their job to respond. Now, that's gets tabled, that gets shelved the minute somebody crosses a border. If we're invaded, it's no longer on the shelf. At this point, the U.S. military is activated to repel borders, if you will, to push these people back across our state lines and our federal lines, and if possible, take the fight to them. You want to fight us? We're going to fight you on your turf, on our terms, but on your turf. That's the best way to do things, as far as we're concerned. Earlier in the year, American forces conducting offensive operations in Siberia. By June, the Soviets had driven the U.S. units back across the Bering Strait, and Alaska became a battleground. Units removed from civil duties to stem these incursions were eventually successful, but the price of a massive breakdown in local law and order. So once the civilian government fell apart, the U.S. military abandoned a lot of those. We don't involve ourselves in internal problems, and the U.S. military backed up the National Guard units, as they're designed to do, in helping control the population and keep law and order as best they could. So when they had to withdraw most of those mainline combat units and send them to the border, so to speak, to deal with these incursions, lack of control, this sudden vacuum needed to be filled, and this is where we see all the nuts and kooks and self-proclaimed warlords and so on crop up, and this is the beginning of the rapid downslide of what's left of the United States as a government and as a country. Independently speaking, we're still a country, but as a collective group, not so much. Goes on into those details. So now we know that the Russians invaded in Alaska. The Canadians and the Americans managed to stop that invasion, but there's still large portions of Alaska under their control. The Mexicans and the Mexican army, and with assistance from the Russians out of Cuba, attacked into Texas. So sections of Texas and southwestern United States are occupied by them and are continuing low-level combat. So we now see we have enemies on two different fronts, as well as internal. And it says here, the annotated targeting listing. The severity of the attack on each target point is represented by a megaton. Rating the weapons exploded there are not necessarily a single weapon. With certain exceptions, only places received half a megaton or more are covered here. Others are covered on individual areas discussed later in the book. All detonations were airbursts unless otherwise noted. Target list is determined. So when we got a list of who got hit, what got hit, and why. So we talk about the target list, right? The obvious things like the Air Force bases. Here's the Emerstor Air Force Base in Alaska. The Alaskan Air Command headquarters got hit by 1 megaton. And then down here in Wilmington, California, the oil refining and storage facilities there got hit by a 1.2. And then we come down Cheyenne Mountain, obviously. The Maryport, Florida port facilities severely damaged by a near miss. Half a ton hit offshore. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, oil refining storage facility, 1.5. So the list is by alphabet. And I always, because I'm, like a lot of people, I'll look at my own home and I'll think, hey, where did we get hit? And nothing in Iowa gets targeted because apparently we don't have anything at the time. So we talk about winter 2000, 2001, things. The last of the fuel reserves are being used up. The last year that we see mass agriculture at this point after 2000 is localized agriculture because they just don't have the fuel to transport large quantities of grains and foodstuffs across the country. We also don't have the fuel sources to operate all those combines and tractors and so on and so forth, and becomes a problem. So localized farming, local communities are banding together using what resources they have to do more and more subsistence farming, which will support themselves marginally through the year, just like it would have 150 years ago, 200 years ago. It's the reason why these huge, massive countries exist today is not because of some guy's or lady's grand idea of this is how this is going to work. It's because of technology and civilization and a very complex system of supply and demand and the ability to do so. So if the American farmer couldn't produce enough food to feed a couple 100,000 people a given year, well, we wouldn't have as population as big as we would. But look at how many of the foreign countries depend on American food production to supplement their own production, because their own production is insufficient to feed the population. And I'm not going to start pointing countries out, but you don't have to go far. You don't have to go far to see just how many countries with large populations do not have sufficient agriculture to produce subsistence, let alone surplus. Now, there's other places that do, and we're not the only ones. The United States is not the only one by far, but it's the truth. And that without that, this is where things really go bad, when people start to starve to death. And starving people will turn into vicious mobs in a hurry. And then those people who do have stuff will become very determined to defend it and protect what they do have. And this is where we see the self-destruction of the law and order thing. So now we got to break down the general events and encounters, information on MilGov, or the military government. MilGov is shorthand name for the U.S. military government, established by General Cummings when he refused to recognize the legitimacy of the reconstituted or rump Congress of 1999. This is a problem where the general at the time felt that these civilians didn't have a good grip on things, and that he wasn't willing to risk what security and safety there was, in his opinion, for the United States, and specifically the U.S. military, to just back down and let them do what they're supposed to do. This caused a problem. And so we got our breakdown of the various U.S. history, unit history, and current status of the various units, divisions wise. And we get the civilian gov. Civilian shorthand for the civilian government. CivGov was created at the election of John Bauer as Speaker of the reconvened House of Representatives in 1999, thus making him President of the United States by default. The capital of CivGov is currently located in Omaha, Nebraska. President Board begins his second term, blah, blah, blah. And it talks about their capabilities or lack of capabilities. One of the biggest problems that they have, and the military has, is communications. And it makes this point. The reason why the MilGov is more stronger and able to react faster to things is because they still have a limited command and control structure. They still have a communications network, as though a crude one, in operations. The civilian government, on the other hand, has problems because it can't contact a lot of places around the country, let alone around the world. So how can you govern something? This is one of the reasons, if you go back in history of the world, why for so much of our period of time, there were so few large governments. You had any countries of significant size, thousands of years ago, or tens of hundreds of years ago, were because they had a nobility system. They delegated authority. You might have had a king, but the king had his barons, his counts, his dukes, or whatever, and they controlled areas, and they themselves had subordinate people who answered to them, and each one controlled their little neck of the woods, but they followed the precepts of the next one, because if they didn't, the next one would come down and land on them with both feet and cut their head off, potentially. Right? You all know how this stuff works, because that's how part of our fantasy role-playing game systems work to some degree, if you look at that level of game control. Communications, the census was a joke. Things to come, elections, a handful of military units that sided with the civilians government and where they're at, what their condition they're in. Uh, Things are not looking well for the civilian government. Then we get into the New America. New America was this huge political movement, if you will. It has roots in the numerous ultra-right-wing militant organizations proliferated throughout North America in the 70s and 80s. Organizations found themselves by Carl Hughes in 79, Unusual Coalition, blah, blah, blah. So this huge pseudo-Christian, huge militant, militia-based organization gained some traction, and they established themselves in cells all over the country. And when things went south, in some cases, they were able to step up. And we interact with some of this stuff in some of the modules and the outcome of them. At some point, the head cheese becomes disconnected from the rest of the organization. He disappears, and it pretty much begins to self-disintegrate at that point, because they don't have a strong leader. That's typical of these things. Now, for a lot of you younger folks or people who didn't pay attention, back in the 80s, we had a lot of stuff on local militias and survivalist groups. They're a lot more low-key now. They still exist, but they're a lot more low-key. But back then, it made a lot of headway in the news, and there was rarely a week or two go by that we didn't hear something about this paramilitary outfit, or these survivalists, and this, these skinhead groups, and that and the other thing. They all kind of was prevalent at that time, which is one of the reasons there's such a pertinent part in the game system. And then we got the rules for the city maker. And like I said, we're still talking about New America here, and we're not going to go into detail. Then we break down the country by region. So here's the New England, including Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and so forth. And I'm not going to read through all this, but you got the various states of the United States and their conditions. Oddly enough, and not totally surprising to me, is that the civilian government is concentrated in the central Midwest, in the Plain States. The fact that they're using Omaha as a base of operations, it's not totally unwarranted. That Iowa is firmly in the civilian side of things, that's typical of Iowans in general, and we are very patriotic. Maybe not as high keyed up as some states are, but we are very patriotic, and we have a large contingent of National Guard and reservists here. We also have this infrastructure that's fairly tight and self-contained. We are bordered on two sides by very large rivers, which gives us some control. You don't think of it, but there's only a handful of bridges that cross the Mississippi, so you're not going to get large bodies of anything across that river without a big fight. And the Missouri is a smaller but faster, or a smaller river, but it serves the same purpose. And then we have, the large areas of wilderness, what I'd call wilderness, but between the north and southern. So, northern Missouri is pretty much the same as Iowa. And southern Minnesota is quite a bit like Iowa until you hit about 50, 80 miles past their border. So it's not unreasonable to figure out this is actually a fairly difficult neck of the woods. There's some other things that I brought up in a video the other night that I've had time to give some thought to. Things that have changed since then. In the last 30 years, since this game system was envisioned, how things have changed in the states in general, and a lot of countries. For starters, we realized that we started to really get the understanding that our infrastructure is in bad shape, that our power distribution system is terrible, and we see this upswing in alternate energy sources. We now have fracking and stuff going on up in the north. We have other methods for getting oil out of the ground, I guess is what I'm saying. Iowa itself is actually probably sitting on some of the largest coal deposits in the world. The central Midwest is just hammered with it. The downside with the coal is they stopped using it back before the turn of the century because it's got a large sulfur content. But the fact that it's still here, it is still a large resource that could be tapped. And if you're in a situation where you're not less inclined to worry about polluting the atmosphere, having that kind of resource under your feet is valuable. We also, in the 90s, began developing ethanol, which means we have numerous refineries to produce ethanol-based fuel substitutes for transportation in this state. And it's supplied by corn and other bio sources, but mostly corn. So we potentially have the means to produce enough biofuel to fuel our agriculture enough to keep the agriculture running, to keep the fuel supply going, and keeping people fed, because they can all work together. And then you add the fact, like I said, we are developing wind turbines and wind generators. There are literally tens of thousands of these things across the state now. I drive around, and there's few places I don't go that I don't run into these things. And there are areas. I remember the first time I went for a ride up north at night in north central Iowa, and I ran across what seemed to be the largest airport runway in the world. There's these rows of red lights that flash in sequence, and I mean in sequence. There are miles and miles and miles of these damn wind generators, and every one of them has a red light on top to warn low-flying aircraft. And for some reason I don't know, every one of them's been synced, so they all sequence, they all flash on and off at the same time. So you see this huge string of Christmas lights that run for 30 miles at a time, and there'll be rows of them, and they all flash off and flash on and flash off and flash on. And it just, I imagine the airplane people flying over looking down like, what the heck's going on down there? And it's the fact that they've got so many of them. We also produce these things here. We have 2 or 3 huge factories now where I know there's several in Newton, which is just up the road from here, about a 30 minute drive to the east of here. Used to be the Maytag factory there. It produced washers and dryers for Maytag. Now it produces wind turbines, the props for them. While we don't have all the parts here, we have a lot of the parts here. So we can keep a considerable amount of these things functioning. And they're independent. That means unless you want to try to target every single one of these things, your EMP blast that hit Omaha is not going to ruin the control construction material, the control systems for these things in central Iowa. It's just not going to happen. And there's thousands of them. So locally speaking, there'll be local power. We're not going to feed power for the nation, but we could keep most of the lights on in big portions of our own state now, and we have the capability of producing the fuel. Between the fuel and the electricity, we can keep the food running. This makes this a very viable chunk of property these days. I don't think a lot of people look at it from that. I'm sure somebody, someplace, in some government think tanks are thinking this stuff quite heavily, and I'm sure that their compadres over in some of our foreign competitor countries are thinking the same thing. But that has that. There you go. This is a very nice supplement to the game system, Howling Wilderness. The United States, honest last legs.